Sanctions. How are sanctions used? Who gets to implement them? And why are some countries allowed to use them against others without ever being affected themselves? Is it just about money and power? According to Global Research, a Canada-based research organization, the international justice system operates much like the domestic one. The rich administer punishment on the poor. The notion of equal justice before the law is as mythical internationally as it is domestically. Who ends up in prison or under sanctions has nothing to do with real justice and everything to do with real power. The dictionary definition of a sanction is a threatened penalty for disobeying a law or rule. Most international sanctions are usually imposed by the United Nations, the European Union, or unilaterally by powerful governments. And they often come in the form of arms embargoes, trade cutbacks, financial restrictions, and limitations on movement, including visa or travel bans. Since 1966, the UN Security Council has established 30 sanctions regimes, from the former Yugoslavia to Iraq, Iran, and Cuba. Anyone can declare sanctions, but that begs the question of how they are governed and if they are legal. There is no actual global organization that enforces and monitors sanctions, and there is no court for sanctioned nations to seek recourse. This enables powerful countries to pursue a might is right policy. So let's look at the United States, for instance. As of May of this year, the US alone has nearly 8,000 sanctions in place. The Treasury Department lists them in different forms, ranging from individuals to companies to entire governments. Last November, when the US imposed the harshest part of its sanctions package against Iran, targeting its main export, oil, it affected trade for all the countries dealing with Tehran. And when Russia was strapped with sanctions by Western nations over the 2014 Crimean crisis, its only effective response was creating a list of countries on which it imposed a food import ban. What could be seen as the most effective economic penalty against the US was the oil embargo of 1973, when OPEC nations led by Saudi Arabia's King Faisal decided to stop exporting oil to the United States, quadrupling oil prices over the next few months. But as the US became more entrenched as virtually the world's only superpower, other attempts at punishment proved unsuccessful. In 1986, the International Court of Justice ruled that U.S. support for rebels fighting to overthrow the Nicaraguan government violated customary international law. But the Reagan administration simply ignored the ruling and refused to pay any reparations. According to The Atlantic, the strength of American sanctions, after all, comes from the centrality of the United States financial system in the global economy and the dollar's status as the world's dominant reserve currency. Sanctions hardly bend the will of the governments that they target. Instead, they see a hike in prices of everyday products used by the general public, such as bread and milk. The current sanctions against Iran even affect the ability to obtain imported medicines. In the case of Iraq, the UN Security Council imposed economic sanctions in August 1990 when it invaded Kuwait, but didn't remove them when Iraqi forces were ousted the following year, using them instead as leverage for other purposes. UNICEF has reported that infant mortality claimed 500,000 children's lives back in the 1990s and early 2000s when sanctions meant to hurt Saddam Hussein were imposed on the country. According to the New York Times, the move only emboldened Saddam Hussein and garnered sympathy and popular support for him by many across the Arab world. Furthermore, a once-growing economy was now dependent on UN food aid. So, an oil for food program was introduced by US President Bill Clinton in 1996, which allowed participating countries to extract Iraq's oil for UN food aid. And in Venezuela, where the US is trying to use sanctions to oust President Nicolas Maduro, the Center for Economic and Policy Research says that sanctions have reduced the availability of food and medicine and increased disease and mortality, including tens of thousands of people with cancer, diabetes, hypertension, and other illnesses. So, sanctions rarely succeed in subduing their intended targeted heads of state, and often end up just hurting the general public.